It is my great pleasure to welcome you today to Mind Matters at Home, brought to you by NAMI Central Texas and Ascension Seton. My name is Karen Reynes. I'm the Executive Director for NAMI Central Texas, and I'm so delighted today that we're able to bring you this topic, Black Mental Health Matters, the effects of community trauma on mental health. We know that that's such an important topic right now. We're so delighted to be able to welcome Rakima Parson of Centered Counseling today to help us talk about this and bring this conversation to a different level. And one of the things that we're doing differently for this webinar, if you've visited with us and joined us for some of the others, is we had a little conversation with Rakima and really decided that we wanted to make it conversational. So we together kind of put together some questions that we thought would be important questions to respond to. And so I'm going to be proposing some of these questions to Rakima and giving her an opportunity again to respond to them. And as I mentioned, we'll watch the chat box as well as the Q&A to see if there's any other great questions that come up. And with that, we'll get started. And before we answer any questions, I do want to give Rakima an opportunity to introduce herself and to tell us a little bit about herself.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Rakima Parson. I'm a licensed professional counselor and registered play therapist. So I work with people of all ages, from age 3 all the way up. Most of my work has been working with people that have experienced trauma. And I'm originally from New Orleans, been in Texas almost a decade now, and in Austin almost 5 years. And so since I've been here, I've worked to get plugged into the community to share information in the community, because I think it's really valuable for people to get information, even if they never step foot in my office. I feel it's my responsibility to share with the community. So thanks for having me today.
Thank you. We're so glad that you're joining us. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with our first question. So can you share a bit about how trauma, as well as racialized trauma in particular, impacts the Black community?
Yeah, so first I want to define trauma, right? And so trauma can be any deeply disturbing event that you experience, right? So everyone internalizes or externalizes traumatic events differently. What causes trauma to stick, or for us to develop symptoms related to trauma, is typically when we experience something that we don't have tools or resources to cope with, and we don't have community to process that trauma with. So for some people, they may experience the same thing as another person, and their reactions are different. And that can be common too. Oftentimes it has to do, again, with that community and attachment piece, and also having resources and skills to cope with what's happened, and to navigate what's happened. So as it pertains to racialized, that's when you experience a distressing event based on your race, right? Or maybe you don't experience it, but your community is experiencing it, which is what we're seeing now. For hundreds of years, racialized trauma has happened and existed, but now with smartphones and video, we're seeing it more and being bombarded with these images. And so there's primary trauma, where a person may experience the trauma themselves, it's happened to them. And then there's this secondary or vicarious trauma, where someone you know experiences it, or you witness it again through social media, through media, seeing this information and images of violence. So when we look at the Black community and impact, again, everyone's impacted differently, but it's a collective trauma that's happening when we identify with the people in the videos that we're seeing that are losing their lives. So it can feel triggering. Two of our innate primal needs are for safety and a sense of control. And so in these moments, it can be hard to feel safe. It can be hard to know what you can control. And so it can really impact the way we move through life. For some people, they may be feeling fear, anger, sadness, right? There's a spectrum and the feelings vary, but it does impact everyone differently. And so again, having tools and resources can help with healing from that trauma in a way that's going to be most effective.
Thank you so much for unpacking all of that. I think in particular, that piece about understanding that everybody responds to trauma in a different way, because I think it's so often easy for people to say, why is that such a big deal? You know, and thinking about a situation or whatever, and maybe not fully understanding how everyone really is different. And I think in particular, what you mentioned about having that community to process it, which I think is really interesting in the midst of everything going on right now, right? Because sometimes that's part of what we've been missing is the community to process that with. Okay, so let's move on then to the next question and unpack more of this. In what ways does racial trauma contribute to the stigma that's related to mental health services?
Yeah, so that's one of those large historical questions, right? So I'll share with our time a little bit about it. So when we think about as a community, as a Black community, I'm, first I'm Black, second I'm a woman, next I'm a therapist, right? So thinking about some of the oral history and things that I've heard growing up and that people in the community share, again, there's this historical piece of times where enslaved people were used for research purposes, right? There's been times where there's been difficulty getting in for services because of this mistrust of service providers, which is based in something that is real and rational and that did happen, right? And so through oral history, we've heard these things, and it's made it hard to enter working with providers, particularly around mental health. And so oftentimes the stigma's there, one, because there's other resources and tools that we've used, right? When we were maybe not given access to resources, we created some resources, right? For some people, that's faith and spirituality in a lot of communities, or talking amongst your peers, talking to your family, finding other ways to cope with mental health conditions. The struggle with that is that sometimes those resources aren't enough, and then we do need mental health providers. And so when we think about racial trauma and we look at the ways that things like what's happening in society, and if you have a provider that you feel like may or may not understand that. When I think about stigma, again, it goes back to really whether or not you feel like you understand mental health services. So there's a part of psychoeducation that goes into that, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing today, why I do the things that I do in the community, because oftentimes we don't have as much information related to mental health services. What does that entail? What does that look like? What is the diagnosis, right? How do I use insurance? How do I find sliding scale options, right? And when there's a lot of questions or confusions around a topic, it can be hard to enter into that journey. So again, when we look at the historical context, sometimes mental health services haven't seemed like something that we had access to or the luxury of utilizing. And it might have felt unsafe, right? If you go in and you tell somebody something that they don't understand, how are they going to react? Is it going to cause danger or harm, right? Is it going to help you? So really looking at ways that, again, the historical context impacts the why. And oftentimes when I talk to communities about stigma, I always want to validate that why, right? Like there's a reason why there's a stigma in the Black community for using mental health services. But I do these presentations because I don't want to stop at the why, right? I think there's a lot of research that shares insight into why the Black community doesn't access resources. But I think sometimes the research stops there, right? We want to get people help seeking. We want to increase help seeking behaviors. We want people to use resources. So I think I don't want to stop at that why people don't use it. I want to kind of move forward and say, okay, so what do we need to do and change in our systems so that people from the Black community will access services?
Thank you. I think I know for myself, learning that historical piece of it was eye-opening. And I think earlier, before you and I, before the webinar started, we were just discussing this, the cultural competency piece and really building that up. And I wonder if that's also part of that, is really understanding the historical aspect of it, because I do think you have to know that to really understand why that stigma is so deep. And then, as you mentioned, I love this notion of that you can't stop there.
Yeah.
And you've got to move on. And how do you create an environment in which people want to seek that out? I'm curious, in your own work, how do you encourage that? The help, the seeking out?
Yeah, the big piece is the psychoeducation. I think having as a Black therapist, right, going out and sharing and being transparent that, again, when I go out and do presentations, there's an aspect of transparency that I want to bring. I think when we think about mental health services, or there is this piece of, I had to go through graduate school to become a mental health professional. So we want to talk about privilege with that, right? And I think some people assume like, oh, you're a therapist, you didn't experience these things, or that's not your story, right? And so it's a part of my duty is to have some transparency where it's appropriate, to share that it is a part of my story, right? I grew up in a family where we didn't access mental health services, and we should have. I experienced childhood trauma. My parents were incarcerated, right? And I didn't have a counselor to talk to that about, right? And so there are these messages that are sent from even my personal experience where it's like, don't go and tell people that. Don't go and tell people what's happening here. And that comes from a place of wanting to be secure and be safe, right? We run the risk sometimes if we share something that isn't understood culturally or in context, that it could harm the family, right? And some of that hurts and harms us too, right? Because there's these family secrets that we shouldn't be keeping. We should have access to resources. But there's this balancing act that oftentimes Black families or families in poverty or families that have experienced trauma have to weigh out those costs and benefits, right? Sending your child to services could impact something in a different way. So really looking at that and how that's going to impact. So again, I think being transparent, having therapists, you know, come out and share just a little bit about, hey, this isn't something that I learned in a book that I'm wanting to tell you. I get why you may feel reticent about accessing services. Here's a little bit about what, you know, my dynamic was, right? And maybe how long it took me to seek help or to get services, or people in my family, right? So just sharing that we're not immune just because we're mental health professionals or mental health advocates of that stigma either.
So I think what you're pointing to, because somebody sort of asked, like, how do we as individuals help change that stigma? But I think you sort of answered that question just now, because I'm hearing education is hugely important, but then also that willingness for us to share our own stories, right? I mean, so to be transparent, and certainly you in your role as a clinician. But I'm interested as well, there's a question that came through, and we sort of were talking a little bit about this before we got started, which is, do you think that the stigma related to mental health services has changed during the pandemic because of the telehealth, and because maybe, again, more need because people are experiencing more of that trauma?
Yeah, I don't know if it's changed the stigma. I think people are still trying to sort out who can I trust, right, when I'm accessing these services. But I do think what has increased and has been that when people were using other resources that weren't traditional mental health services, right, like using spiritual practices, or using, I can connect with my family and we can talk about what's going on, or I have a social support group. Those resources, because of the pandemic, they're not able to tap into. And so I think because those things aren't there, people are saying, okay, I've tried everything that I could try within my power and control right now. I need access to someone that can help me facilitate this work that I want to do, hold me accountable to doing work towards healing. So I think it's this kind of bubble up effect of like, there were things that people were able to do before, whether they were healthy coping mechanisms or not healthy coping mechanisms. People had coping mechanisms. Everybody has a way that they cope. And they don't have access to those coping mechanisms anymore. And now, again, I think with increased information around mental health services, I think in media, people are talking about mental health more, again, with that education around services and people sharing their stories or positive experience of accessing mental health services. People are starting to kind of put their toe in a little bit and make those phone calls and reach out to providers more. So I have seen an increase of interest, right, that I've heard other colleagues share about of people accessing mental health services or having interest in accessing mental health services.
Yeah, that's interesting. Somebody else just messaged and sort of agreed with that, saying they don't think that the stigma has changed, but they definitely think that maybe there's been more realization of the need for mental health services, like that's risen. So let's move on to the next question. We've sort of alluded to it just a little bit, but it's really, again, related to the pandemic itself. And then in addition to sort of experiencing the racial trauma, you know, how does the pandemic impact mental health and well-being?
Yeah, so this is, I think, all of our first pandemics, right? Like I have not experienced the coronavirus pandemic before. This is my first time, right? For many of us, we haven't experienced a pandemic at this level before. And so again, validating that, again, people are going to feel differently about it. Whenever I do a presentation about it, I share that for some people, the slower pace of things, they're finding that refreshing, right? And a lot of other things in their lives haven't changed. And I want to validate that too, right? That it may not be a negative experience for everybody. We want to validate the whole spectrum. But for other people, this has been a very trying time. And I think particularly in the Black community, and we're thinking about racial trauma during a pandemic, again, when we talk about community and where people typically were able to go and be recharged and be refreshed, now community and interconnectedness is a risk, right? Like deciding to say we're gonna have Sunday dinner, or I'm gonna go be with people that fill up my cup, that I love, that I enjoy being around. That could be a risk. Being able to spend time with people that might be vulnerable to the virus, that's a risk, right? And so really weighing out, you know, for my mental health, I may need this interconnectedness, but for my physical health, I don't have access to it right now. So it's really coupled. And then when we talk about unpacking the racial trauma and we're seeing these images now with the slower pace, we're seeing that's kind of all we're seeing. And when we talk about that vicarious trauma, there's research that shows that now people are having these anxious symptoms, you know, traumatic responses to this chronic media exposure. And so it's really important. Again, we don't have a lot of the other distractions that we had, which is positive for the cause, right? We want people to know what's going on. And I think being informed is important. But I do encourage people to minimize their media interaction when they start to feel so triggered by these images, because you can have a traumatic experience because of those images. And so in the midst of the pandemic, particularly with the Black community, and I think I talked about this one time before I was speaking, and I shared that for lots of reasons, culturally, many people in the Black community are collective, right? Like it's a collective culture. For some people, you know, they're used to getting together more frequently. For other people, there's intergenerations that live in a home together, right? And so now with the pandemic, that's all being impacted, right? If someone relied on a grandparent for childcare of their child, that can't happen, right? So stress levels are really high. If someone felt like, hey, my cup is filled up from this interaction, you know, stress levels are really high because there's not a lot of opportunities for that. So in addition to the racial pandemic, there's also this piece of health. And then we've seen health-wise and from medical experts that the Black community has been hit particularly hard by the coronavirus as far as outcomes for how the virus is impacting us physically. And there's lots of reasons for that. And as a mental health professional, I look at the ways that chronic stress, chronic trauma impact our physical health as well. It makes us more susceptible to this virus.
It's a lot for sure, right? So, okay, so let's move on to the next question, in which I think we want to really try to unpack even more some of the issues around the race concerns. So, racial microaggressions and cultural mistrust significantly impact mental health outcomes in the Black community. You've alluded to all of that. Can you provide an example of some of the unique challenges that Black people face while navigating the mental health system, and explain how these challenges reinforce mistrust of the mental health system?
Yeah, so that's a lot to unpack. So I'm gonna take a deep breath and regulate myself and get ready to kind of go through some of those things in a way that people can hear and understand. So racial microaggressions, again, those I'll give an example of what those look like and how they might show up just in everyday life, but then also as someone's entering the office of a provider for services. And so those are things that happen that people say that may to others seem like a compliment, right? And so that's the tricky part about microaggressions. someone might say, oh, you're really articulate, or, you know, this happened or that, or you change your hair so much, right? And it doesn't seem extremely offensive to people outside of the community, but when you hear it, you know, it comes off like a compliment, but it doesn't feel like a compliment, right? It's not internalized that way. Microaggressions are tricky in that way. They're hard to explain. They're hard to explain to other people that they're happening. With that, how that impacts, again, that can show up. It shows up in our day-to-day life. It can show up in a counseling room, right? It can show up at work. So there's lots of times that those things happen. And what they say is that those are little tiny cuts, right? Little tiny like trauma cuts, right? And then over time it builds up to where things feel uncomfortable. So accessing services might feel uncomfortable. One example I can share is even after introducing myself and saying my name, there's been times where I've been asked if I have a nickname, right? That's one example, even as a clinician, that's a microaggression, right? If someone's introducing themselves the way that they want to be addressed, asking if they have a nickname is a microaggression, right? So things like that, again, they don't seem completely overt. They don't seem that bad, right, in the grand scheme of things, but they have a tremendous impact on the person on the receiving end of them, and they're hard to explain. So over time of having experiences that are just hard to explain, you feel them in your gut, you're driving home from an interaction and you can think about them and you replay them like, huh, this is what was said, right? But they're hard to put your finger on or hard to explain to other people. Over time, it will impact help-seeking behaviors, right? Because there's this level of feeling misunderstood or feeling othered. The piece when we talk about navigating some of the other challenges would be, think about it this way. I think oftentimes there are references to things. And so as much as we'd like to say that a lot of our work is not subjective, there are subjective aspects of the work that we do as mental health professionals, right? That are based on worldview. And so when I think about some of the things that I hear from the community when they share about not wanting to go to services, it's about being concerned about diagnosis, being concerned about different things like that. And there are times, and there's research that shows that oftentimes people in the Black community can be misdiagnosed. One of the reasons for that is the subjectivity of worldview. And when you're doing a diagnosis as a clinician, you're having to pick apart, right, what's realistic, what's rational, what's irrational, right, to kind of make those diagnoses. And again, in your worldview, if your worldview says that something's irrational and this person's sharing it with you, then they might be misdiagnosed. An example of that could be, again, when we talk about the racialized trauma, if somebody's saying, I'm fearful to drive to work, I'm scared to do this, I feel like somebody's, you know, watching me or doing this, that might come off like paranoia, right, if it's outside of context, right? So we want to understand cultural context. And so I think for providers, it's important to understand cultural context and to understand context. Because out of context, it does sound like, huh, this person is really worried about XYZ. And if you've never experienced XYZ, it may feel irrational to you. So I think oftentimes when people feel misunderstood or feel like the things that they're saying are phrases, common cultural phrases, jargon, right, are not understood, then they can be misconstrued. And ultimately that can impact diagnosis, that can impact treatment planning, and all sorts of things.
Thank you. I feel like you handled that question really well because it was a lot to unpack. And I love that you provided some very specific examples because I think otherwise people don't really understand what does that actually look like. And so I think that was really helpful as well. So I want to move on to the next question. And I think somebody actually asked a question that I think really fits in with this as well. So I'd like for you to consider both of these things. So the question itself that we had prepared to ask you was really about what action steps can providers take to address institutional racism in the mental health care system. But I would also love to hear your thoughts on, someone asked, what are some things that employers can do to support Black employees who are coping with both the pandemic and the racialized stress? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on both of those from both the provider perspective and this institutional racism, but also the perspective of employers and what they might do during this time as well to address these concerns.
Yeah, I think when I think about providers, so earlier this week, I had the opportunity to attend a really awesome training about race. And so there were about 450 people on that call, many of which were mental health professionals. And it was nice to see everybody with an interest in learning more about race. And so when I think about what providers can do, again, it's this constant curiosity, right? When we talk about cultural competence, there's not an end point of which, like, I took a class and I'm competent, right? In any area of our work. We do continuing education every 2 years we have to submit our continuing education. And again, I think it's a constant work around understanding culture, understanding institutional racism. So I think first, again, with everything I share, I go back first to education, right? So providers having a curiosity to get education and information about what's going on. And again, to have that context. If a provider is not experiencing something personally and they're not taking the time to go and learn about what's happening for other communities, then again, they don't have that context when someone sits across from them to say, this happened. And that can feel not validating to a client, to kind of go back to some of the other pieces, right? So if there's just been a murder that we've witnessed as the Black community on social media and we've seen it, and you go into a counseling office and the counselor has no clue that just happened, or context for that, that doesn't feel validating, right? And so the first question of saying, how's your week, can feel, it can feel awkward, because it's like, well, like, my week is this way, right? And having to explain that. So I think, again, it's this curiosity of knowing what's going on, knowing what's happening, outside of maybe a bubble, right? Like, being curious to step out of the box and kind of see what's happening. I think that part. And then the other piece is in the training program, right? So before someone steps out, into the field, incorporating this into training, incorporating this curiosity. I'm on a board that provides some training around play therapy, and something that we've implemented is that every training should have something to do with culture. Right. And so we could be talking about any aspect of play therapy, but there has to be this component where we talk about something cultural, right? The cultural implications. And so I think things like that, implementing that throughout, so that it's not just a stopping point of like, hey, we had this one workshop about culture. No, everything that we do should foil in and incorporate culture. So that curiosity, that interest, and then that advocacy, that's a part of our ethics. Right? So advocating is a part of our ethics. So when you see things that are systemic racism, things that aren't just, advocating, to bring change around that in order to better serve our clients. Because one thing that I'll say, I struggle with sharing tips for coping, right? Sharing tips for coping with racial trauma. We should not be coping with racial trauma. It should not be happening. And so I always like to use different language around that, because I don't want people to internalize that we've got to build up more resilience, against racial trauma. It shouldn't be happening. It's abnormal. And any way that we're responding to it, our trauma response is a normal response to an abnormal thing. So I think for clinicians to kind of understand that and to carry that and to talk about that is really important with their clients. And then I think the other question was about employers and what they can do. That's another passion area of mine. And I've talked a lot about cultural bias and how it impacts the work that people do. And when we think about racial trauma, we know that it starts in schools, right? And I always tell people that those experiences, the kids in elementary school, middle school, high school, they're gonna be employed somewhere at some point, right? So those things kind of carry through. And so after having years and years of those microaggressions, those traumatic experiences based on race, then you show up to a workplace where those things continue to be reinforced, right? Because there's a systemic piece that can be challenging. So for employers, again, this curiosity, this interest, trainings, right? Like doing different things for your organization that provide not just a one time a year at a retreat, right? Ongoing education around culture, so that we can minimize those microaggressions, so that we can make the workplace feel more safe. Again, when we go into staff meetings, if we aren't acknowledging, right, why that day might be harder for a staff member who just witnessed a murder, on social media. right? So again, it's about acknowledging the things that are going on in the world, even when they feel uncomfortable. So I think employers, again, being curious, getting education around culture and race, and then providing training to your staff, offering resources to your staff, checking in to see how people are doing, and making sure there's outlets. I think in the workspace, many offices will have an EAP, so sharing that information with everybody, but particularly when these events happen, making sure people know that they can tap into mental health resources.
Rakima, I love what you said about curiosity, and that you addressed it in both of the both questions, that it was like this, that it isn't also about just okay, check the box, we've done that training, or I read that book, or whatever it is, that it really is about this continuing curiosity. And I love that. And I also love what you said about the coping piece, because we are then normalizing something that should be abnormal, right? So those were powerful statements. While we're still talking about providers, there was a question that came through that I thought fit nicely with this, so I thought I'd bring this up. Especially from the perspective of a therapist, that I think this might be helpful for this person and for other folks listening. How do you include your therapist who does not look like you in this type of conversation without feeling like you need to teach them the history of African Americans before you get to your own story? So what does that look like in a therapeutic setting? Like if you've got someone who who you may feel like may benefit from understanding that, how do you do that?
Yeah, well, a part of my first reaction to that is that that's not the client's job, right? And so I think when it gets to a point where you feel like it's a requirement, that can be hard, that can feel exhausting. But I think if a client feels comfortable, that should be a part of the collaborative experience. So I think it depends on the client. Like, it's always client first. It's always client centered. You know, if the client feels like, hey, I've built this really good rapport with my therapist, I feel supported, but there are some aspects that I want to give context to, and that feels safe and that feels comfortable, I think the client definitely, again, that process is collaborative. So for sure, go with it and share that information. But I think there's another piece of it where then you're doing work that you didn't necessarily come to the session to do, and that can feel exhausting for a client. So again, I'd encourage people to kind of check in with themselves and see how they feel. Do you feel like you have the capacity to do a history lesson, you know, in session, or do you feel like that's gonna, you know, further exhaust you? And so check in with that and see where you are. But I do believe that most therapists, they want the collaborative approach, and they welcome information, and they welcome, you know, clients to share with them so that they can get context and get information and get, and to be able to better help them. So if there is information that you feel comfortable sharing, by all means share with providers. But I also want to encourage people that, you know, they don't have to make it their responsibility to do the education in the context of trying to do their healing.
I love that. Do it, but it's not your responsibility to do it. Okay, so let's move on to what I believe might be their last question. And then we'll open it up to some additional questions because we've got time. So if you've got a question you'd like to ask Rakima, you can drop it into the Q&A or the chat. But let's get to that last question, which I know you felt was the most important question for today.
Yeah.
What are some of the ways that people can maintain their well-being during these really difficult times?
Yeah. This was the most important question for me to make sure that we had time to talk about, because I think this is the root of it. I think, again, people in the Black community know all too well what trauma feels like, what racialized trauma feels like during these times. And so sharing context and sharing what I did on the front end was important. But I think the biggest piece of this is helping people to be well while experiencing all of these things. And I said it before, I don't want to teach coping skills to cope with racism, right? That's not my desire. My desire, though, is to help people learn to buffer what's happening so that they can be well in the midst of these unjust things or abnormal things that are happening. The first thing I want to say as we get into this is that overcompensating or feeling like we have to overcompensate for racism is exhausting. It can feel exhausting, right? So it's important to implement these steps to be well. What I mean by that is, first things, we want to make sure that we have ways to regulate ourselves, our breathing, our energy, our nervous systems, and ways to ground ourselves. So I'm going to walk us through a really easy breathing technique that I share with people. I did not make this up, right? This is something that's commonly used for breathing. And so it's called box breathing. And so it's pretty easy. As I draw the box, you breathe. And so we'll just walk through this together. So as I draw the box this way, you breathe in. When I go down, you breathe out, you hold, breathe in, hold, breathe out, hold. You can draw that box as many times as you need to draw that box, right? Some days we need more breathing than others. We always need to breathe, right? It really helps to regulate us. It's one of the easiest, cheapest, quickest things we can do to help regulate ourselves. And I think sometimes we forget to breathe. You may have noticed, like, you're in the middle of a rough day and you're like, I'm taking these really shallow breaths, right? We want to make sure we breathe deeply. That really helps to regulate our nervous system. So you can draw that box like I did, where people can see it. You can draw it on your leg. You can draw it on, the desk at work or the kitchen table if it's a stressful evening, right? Like, you can draw that little box to yourself and nobody has to know you're doing it, and you can remember to breathe that way. The next piece is finding ways to ground yourself. So one thing I like to share with people is the 5 senses. And so we have a little time to do it, so I'll walk y'all through it just a little bit. But again, you want to just look at your 5 senses. So the first thing would be identifying when you're having those overwhelming moments and you need to come back to the present, right? You may have just seen something that's disturbing. You heard something distressing. You're having a trauma response based on the things that are going on. You want to ground yourself to be present so that you can, make an action plan to take care of yourself. So that first thing is looking at the senses, right? So the first thing we do, or I would encourage you to do, is to say, what's 5 things I can see? And so I'll walk us through this, right? So right now, 5 things I can see. I can see my laptop where I'm talking to y'all. I can see a plant. I can see the sofa that I'm sitting on. I can see my journal, and I can see a book, right? So in that moment, while I'm trying to identify what I see, I have to be present. I have to be in the room that I'm in because I have to identify those things. The next thing will be, what's 4 things you can feel, right? So what's 4 things you can touch? So right now, if y'all are watching, you can try this too. I'll walk us through this one. 4 things that I can touch right now. I can touch the sofa that I'm sitting on. I can touch my laptop. I can touch the book. I can touch my arm, right? The next thing would be, what's 3 things that you can hear, right? This one requires a little bit more effort, right? So each time we're doing this, we're really working to be in the room, in the space, in our bodies, like where we are, to ground ourselves. So 3 things I can hear. There's somebody outside of where I am. They're on a motorcycle, so I can hear that. I can hear the air conditioner, and I can hear myself talking, right? And so then what's 2 things you can smell, right? So I can smell my lotion. I can smell what I cooked for lunch, right? And then the last one will be, what's 1 thing you can taste, or 1 thing that you last ate, right? So find that sense of taste, right? And so I think I last ate some pasta salad, right? So as you walk through the 5 senses, now I'm in the room, I'm here. I even feel more calm that I walked us through that, right? It can be nerve-wracking to give a presentation, right? So me walking through that box breathing activity, walking through the 5 senses, I even feel more regulated. Those are things that you can go to at any point and you can try to help regulate yourself. Once you've done that and you feel regulated, you're in a good space, the next thing I encourage people to do is to look at these different buckets. So I typically share with people, look at the physical aspect, look at the social aspect, look at the emotional aspect, and then you can also look at the environmental aspect. There's other aspects to look at. There's 8 dimensions of wellness. Again, this is research-based information. I'm not making it up. This is information that's been researched by wellness experts, right? So looking at these different dimensions, those are just a few that I share with people. So some examples, when we're looking at the physical aspect of things, look at ways that you can be physically active, right? Based on your ability and mobility level. right? Whatever that looks like for you. But find ways to move that feel comfortable for you. That can impact and help with sleep. It can help a lot of different things when we talk about mental health. So look at that piece. I also, in the physical aspect, want to talk about sleep for people. Again, one of the ways that I think historically and researched that, you know, the Black community has internalized racism and in historical systemic racism has been this productivity culture, right? Of I have to work really hard to get where I want to be. I have to work harder, or I have to do more, or putting off sleep or putting off rest and kind of seeing it as something that's not valuable. And so when we talk about the physical aspect, I always want to encourage people to get a really good, healthy sleep routine, you know, some sleep hygiene, things that you can do to implement to be well. Sleep significantly helps. Lack of sleep impacts, increased sleep impacts your nervous system, your ability to regulate, your ability to cope, to manage frustration, agitation, all sorts of things. So sleep really plays a big role in it. So I want us to always look at that bucket, the physical bucket, and see where you are with sleep. Are there things you need to adjust in your sleep? Are you not getting enough sleep? Are you getting too much sleep? Your body will let you know. But I want to encourage people not to put off rest or to write rest off as something that's not valuable or important for their mental health. The next piece would be that social piece. Again, looking at where that bucket can be filled, particularly during the pandemic, right? There's some ways that that's going to have to look differently. So again, addressing that area, making some notes around like, hey, are there people I haven't talked to in a while that bring me joy? How can I talk with them or reach out to them in a way that, again, is safe for me to do, but I can have that bucket filled of the social aspect of things. The next piece is the emotional piece, right? Check in with your feelings. Again, there's varied feelings. And I like to tell people that we don't want to tell people how to feel about something. There's no wrong feeling. There's no bad feeling. Even anger, the feeling itself is not a bad thing, right? Sometimes the way we behave when we're angry is something that we want to adjust or we want to make changes to, but all feelings are valid. And so again, checking in with that emotional piece and saying, hey, what are my feelings about things? Do I find that my sleep is impacted by my feelings or my worries? Is there a way that you can write those down? The emotional piece too, reaching out for services. I know Karen shared in the beginning, there's a list of resources on their website about connecting to services, peer support groups, counseling, emergency services. That's all a part of our emotional well-being and a part of that bucket. So check in with those feelings and see if you have coping skills to manage those feelings. And if you don't feel like you have enough of them, really increasing your just your capacity to feel comfortable with connecting to a provider in the community that can help you navigate that. And then the last piece is environment. Especially, I wanted to share about this today because of the pandemic. A lot of us are doing a lot of things in our home spaces and where we live. So sometimes if that bucket doesn't feel balanced, we can feel discomfort. So it's important to find ways, again, ways that are, they don't have to be expensive or take up a lot of space, but it could be as little as an essential oil, right? A diffuser, something that helps in your environment to kind of perk you up when you're having to work through your workday. A new pillow, right? Just little things around your environment that can change things. It might be a new habit of saying, I'm gonna clean up at night instead of in the morning so that when I wake up, I don't feel completely exhausted before I start my day, right? So looking at things in your environment that you can shift to help you be well, particularly again, during these two pandemics. And then the last couple things about being well, when you look at those buckets and you see, okay, hey, I don't have enough of this bucket filled up, or this bucket is too full, right? For some people, they're like, my environment bucket is too full. I've really focused on that, but I haven't focused on anything else. Or my social bucket is too full. Like I have too many Zoom calls. I have too many, nights for that. And I don't feel filled up in this way, right? Find ways to balance them as much as you can, and it'll ebb and flow. It'll change from week to week. It'll change from day to day even, and that's okay. But evaluate it and look into it and see what feels good for you. And then once you've done that, the next step is to know that accountability is helpful. So, you might sit down and go through these steps with me today, but if nobody ever checks in with you, or if you don't tell somebody else that, hey, I have this goal to improve physically or mentally or emotionally, if we don't have accountability, it can be hard to keep up with that sometimes. So if you feel like you will need accountability, check in with a peer, check in with a friend, someone you trust. Of course, I'm going to advocate check in with a therapist if you need to. But having accountability can help you stay on track with being well and taking care of yourself. And the last few things I want to say about this, again, I think especially looking at the Black community and thinking of my own experience, there have been times where you feel like you have to earn care, right? You have to wait and save it up. Like when I've done this, or when I finish this project, or when I've worked this hard, or I've washed every dish, you know, and washed every load of clothes, then I can rest. The trouble in saving up for self-care is that oftentimes we burn out before we even get there. So my encouragement is that we implement self-care and being well into our day-to-day lives in a way that's sustainable. And it doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to take hours. It doesn't have to be a massage. It doesn't have to be something elaborate. It could be something as small as saying, I'm going to do my box breathing, you know, today. I'm going to do this in between this. Right? I'm going to take a walk, or I'm going to sit outside. You know, I like the heat, so that's my own preference, but everybody doesn't like the heat. But looking at things that you can do on a daily basis that are sustainable so that we minimize this burnout, we minimize the crisis, right? If we're proactive about these things, if we're proactive about connecting to a provider, then we can minimize some of the distress in those ways. But we have to implement it in a way that's sustainable and that happens before we reach burnout. So again, you don't have to earn it. It's your right to be well. So I just want to remind people that you have a right to be well. And so really looking at it that way, opposed to feeling like I have to deserve wellness.
I love that. You gave us so many great tools and things to think about. And that made me think of a couple of things that I want to make sure that we cover before our time runs out, because you talked about how to be well, the things that we need to do to be well. But I think one of the things that sometimes people are too afraid to ask is, how do I know when I'm not well and that maybe I do need help? So there's that. And then I think a lot of times people get to that place of recognizing that they need help and they don't know what they should do. They don't know how to start down that path for seeking help. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think what I will share, when we think about any of the symptoms, right? I think sometimes people will, in the past, I've seen even friends, they'll say, I went online and I saw all these symptoms and I have all these symptoms, right? What does that mean, right? So I think there's this piece of understanding, again, when to say that I'm experiencing these things and it's at a point where I'm so distressed that I can't function. And so that's what we look at as mental health professionals and encourage people to say, hey, like, is your daily functioning impacted, right? So are your symptoms or things that you're experiencing stopping you from getting up for work, stopping you from, you know, doing things you would have typically liked to do, or, you know, tending to things that you typically would have? When you start to see that it's impacting your daily functioning, that's usually a flag to say, hey, I really need to reach out for services. But there's also a piece that's proactive, which is a part of my my goal, right? Like big picture, like what I love to see in the world is these proactive approaches, right? So before our daily functioning gets impacted, how do we be proactive around incorporating wellness, services, right? So counseling doesn't just have to be for trauma or for a disaster or something big that's happened. It could be a life transition, right? Moving to a new city, or, you know, parents that are expecting their first child, or, you know, for a child that's going to become a big sibling, right? So there's lots of different things that I think that we can access services for, that people don't always think about, but they're proactive, right? Because if we look at prolonged isolation, if we think about someone who's moved to a new city, right? Initially, it might not be impacting your daily functioning, but over time, you might wake up and say, hey, I feel really sad. You know, this is impacting me, right? So if we are proactive about things, we can, you know, anticipate what we might be feeling down the line. We can access services earlier on. But I think for people that are curious to know, like, when is enough, it's typically when it starts to impact your daily functioning, and you're not able to do the things that you need to do or want to do.
And then I think in regards again to this, I think sometimes people are a little uncomfortable about, again, starting that process of seeking out a therapist. I'm curious if you have any suggestions. In other words, I think some people don't know, like, how do I know if it's a good fit for me as far as a therapist? And are there questions that I should ask before I begin that relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, so I always encourage individuals that are seeking service. Again, this is where you can ask questions, right? And so I think some people feel maybe a little bashful about asking certain questions, but you can make phone calls, right? You can look at a list of people that you're interested in seeing. I always encourage people to talk with them, right? So beyond the website and the information you see, I always encourage to do that consultation call, right? Before you start services where you talk to the provider, you talk to the therapist and get more information. During that call, I encourage people to ask whichever questions they want, but particularly if we're thinking about race-based questions, right? You can ask the therapist, what's their knowledge around this particular culture, or how much experience do they have with this particular issue, what approach do they use to counseling, right? So there's different questions that you can ask. I also feel like there's this feeling of when you make the calls, you can get more of the feeling of the vibe of what the person brings to the table, other than just looking at a website, right? So you can kind of build up this idea of like, do I feel like I have a rapport just from that 15-minute conversation with the person that you're making a call to? But clients always have the right to advocate for themselves. They always have the right to change providers, to change therapists, right? So I encourage people to do that too. If you start in a process and you feel like it's not a good fit, you can always, not schedule anymore and pick a different person. So I don't ever want people to feel like, because I've heard where people have said, well, I tried this person, I didn't have a good experience. And I'm like, well, what else? Right? So I want to encourage people that even though they may have this experience where it doesn't feel like a fit, they have the right to end that therapeutic relationship and start another one, right? Find someone else who might be a fit. In some of the ways that I encourage people to look, I really like the use of the tool Psychology Today, because you can search based on preferences, you can search based on your zip code, you can search based on subject matter expertise. So it's almost like social media. Well, it is. It's like social media for finding a therapist. They have a picture, some people have videos, and you can change the filters to filter it down to somebody that might seem like a good fit for you. And then from there, you start to make the calls. The other piece is looking at insurance and sliding scales. So there's ways that you can contact, if you are insured, contacting your insurance provider and asking them for a list. And you can ask, oftentimes they have representatives that can narrow down the list for you too. You can share, what information you're looking for, what kind of therapist you're looking for, and they can provide you with the list as well. And then the other piece of that, again, always whenever you're provided with something, feel free to call. Most people have a 15-minute free consultation phone call, and you can check in with them and get more information from them. And so I think somebody asked a question about what was it, and it was Psychology Today. So you can go there and kind of narrow the search to kind of find a provider that way. The other piece, one of the gifts of using technology a lot more right now is that a lot of providers have gotten more comfortable with telehealth, myself included. It's not something that I implemented before. I really liked being in person with my clients, but now I'm finding it to be a valuable tool. And one of the things that I think is most valuable is that it's opening up the door for people to be able to connect with a good fit. And what I mean by that is that typically, if a provider provides services, they provide for all of Texas, right? So you're licensed in Texas. And so what might have been a barrier before, which was distance, right? When we're doing telehealth, it kind of cuts down on some of that. So if there's a provider where you might live South Austin and there's a provider that's North Austin, and in Austin traffic, after work, that just seemed unreasonable. And that was the provider you really wanted, but you felt limited geographically or, to your, mile radius because of traffic. Now it's opened that up. So just reminding people that most providers right now are providing virtual sessions. And it may change in the future as things become more safe to be together. But right now, that is another thing that's kind of positive during this time of us using technology, is that it opens up the door to be able to find a fit, I think.
Yeah, I want to say that I think most of the folks we've been hearing from that have been trying, telehealth during this time we've heard really positive things, and I know I have as well in my own experience. And yes, I want to double down on that notion of using psychology today. It's how I found my therapist. I mean, it's just such a great tool because it really helps narrow down what you're looking for. So we're running out of time, but there was one last question that I thought was a really powerful question that I wanted to ask you before we finish up. So as a white person, what should I do to keep in mind when I reach out to check in on the mental health of my Black friends? Is there a best way to ask how they're doing? Someone that's listening in offered that question. I thought it was a really great question.
Yeah, I think, and the thing that comes to mind first is the relationship and the rapport, right? So I think it's just about if you've already had the relationship. So if y'all are friends, you have an aspect of understanding them and kind of understanding how they respond to certain questions and how they respond to certain things. And I think that's one of the big things is about having rapport and having relationship. When we ask certain questions in relationship, oftentimes they feel differently than if we're asking a question outside of a relationship. It can feel more like expectation, right? Like, like, oh, I don't know this person very well and they're asking me this information, and it can feel like you have to have an answer for it. But I think from what the person's sharing is that if it's a friend, then typically it's about the relationship and really doing what feels comfortable in the context of that relationship and how y'all communicate typically when anything's going on, when any traumatic event is going on, and digging into that. And then giving the person space to not answer, that question or to not respond to that if they don't feel comfortable. Just sharing support.
Yeah, what I hear you saying is that, again, if there's a friendship there, then there's some context to it, which is a whole lot different than potentially asking someone who you barely know, and thinking back to what you talked about in terms of the microaggression kind of piece, because it's like I've heard folks talk about that of just so are you okay? And the way it is asked in such a way that sort of diminishes the person, I think can certainly put a different kind of spin on that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're bumping up against on 3 o'clock. And so I really just wanted to give you an opportunity is there anything else that you want to leave us with before we end our time together? And then obviously I just want to thank you for your time. I think you've given us a lot of great things to think about, and I look forward to having you back, because I think certainly for us as an organization, we're getting curious. And I think hearing you today was really inspiring of just reminding us of the power of that, of continuing to just be curious. And how do you integrate this in such a way that it doesn't become just this, oh, it was Minority Mental Health Month, so let's do this. But so I'm looking forward to having you back again. And again, want to extend my appreciation for your time today. So any other last things that you'd like to leave us with today before we say goodbye?
So thank you. Thanks for having me. And I think the biggest takeaway and what I hope that people will take away is, particularly as we talk about Black mental health mattering, really encouraging the community to take time to be well. That was the part that I wanted to spend the most time on. We, again, understand the historical context of everything that's going on. As a community, we felt it. We feel it in our bodies. We feel it in intergenerationally. And so ultimately we want to take time to be well so that we can sustain ourselves during these trying times, we are resilient. But I think oftentimes I want to remind people that tears, sadness, fear doesn't make you less resilient. So I really want to remind people that those are natural feelings. And so you can be strong and resilient and still, feel distressed during the racial trauma that we're experiencing during a pandemic. So just want to remind people that strength looks differently in different seasons of your life. And so again, reminding people of the resources, please check out the resources when you feel like that strength is kind of wearing and you need accountability and help and resources, and there's a therapist that you might be able to connect with. I want to encourage people to take the leap.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again. Thank you to all of you who joined us today. I know a number of you asked about the recording for today's webinar, and that will be sent out to you via email. And then we'll also be on our website at namicentraltx.org. And in fact, you mentioned about resources, and I was thinking about some of the things that you shared. We did a webinar with some folks from AISD on regulating, like it was emotional hacks is what it was called. And they did such a fantastic job of providing many of the things that you talked about, but they did like a full hour of all kinds of different things and really explained why it works. So that's a great webinar to follow this up with if you're interested in learning more about that. And again, Rakima, thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you again. We'll be sharing soon our plans for August. We'll be back again in August, and we'll have an opportunity. I think we're going to cover some great tools and ideas for folks to prepare for what will be a difficult start to a school year this year, right? So I think we're going to have some folks from AISD join us again to talk a little bit about that. So we'll keep checking our website and our social media for more information about what that topic will be and when it's going to happen. And until then, we look forward to hearing more from you in the community, and we thank all of you who were with us today. Have a great day. Bye.